That night with my son Liam was the craziest yet most intriguing night I had ever experienced in my life. My name is Emma, and I want to share a story about something that happened between my son and me. It's not easy to talk about, but it's something I've kept inside for too long. Liam is now 19 years old, but it all started a few years ago, after my husband Mark passed away. Losing Mark was one of the hardest things I've ever had to face, and it left Liam and me alone in life without him. At first, it was tough. Liam became quiet and withdrawn, spending most of his time in his room or hanging out with friends. He avoided talking about Mark or anything related to his death, and I didn't want to push him. Instead, I focused on making our home as warm and welcoming as possible. I cooked his favorite meals, left little encouraging notes on his desk, and tried to ensure he knew I was always there if he needed to talk. But for months, he kept his distance. Then one evening, he walked into the kitchen while I was cleaning up after dinner. His sudden appearance startled me, but I was thrilled to see him. He didn't often approach me like that. "Do you need any help, Mom?" he asked, his voice gentle, but steady. I turned to him, surprised by the offer. "Sure, you can dry the dishes," I said, handing him a towel. We worked in silence for a while, and I couldn't help but feel a little relieved. It was the first time he voluntarily spent time with me in what felt like forever. "How was school today?" I asked, trying to start a conversation. "Fine," he said without looking up. That was all. I didn't press him further. "If you ever want to talk, I'm here," I added, glancing at him softly from the corner of my eye. He nodded but said nothing else. Over the next few weeks, I began noticing small changes. Liam started spending more time around me, sitting with me in the living room while I watched TV or helping with small tasks around the house. He even began opening up a little more, telling me about his classes and college plans. I felt a glimmer of hope, as if we were finally finding a way back to normal. But then one evening, something happened that made me question everything. We were having dinner together. Liam had cooked that night, a simple pasta dish he had learned from a friend. While we ate, he looked at me and said, "You're amazing, Mom." I chuckled lightly, brushing off the compliment. "Thanks, Liam." "That means a lot," I said, trying to keep my tone light. But his expression didn't change. He looked at me with an intensity that made my stomach churn. "What's wrong?" I asked gently, cautiously. "Nothing," he said quickly, shaking his head. "I just wanted to say thank you, for everything." I nodded, unsure of how to respond. The moment was strange, but I told myself I was overthinking it. He was just being kind, wasn't he? That crazy night hadn't happened yet, but this was certainly the beginning of it. After that evening, things began to shift. Liam started hanging around me more often, finding reasons to sit close to me on the couch or linger in the kitchen while I cooked. At first, I thought it was sweet. I told myself he was just trying to reconnect after all the time we had spent grieving in our own ways. But then his gaze started lingering longer. His compliments became more frequent and more personal. "You look beautiful today, Mom," he said one morning as I stood at the sink, washing dishes. "Thank you, sweetheart," I replied, trying to keep my tone light. But the way he said it, the way he looked at me, made me feel uneasy. One evening, we were sitting on the couch watching a movie. Liam had picked a comedy we had both seen dozens of times before. Midway through, I realized he was sitting closer to me than usual, our shoulders almost touching. When I shifted slightly, he didn't move away. "You're always so busy," he suddenly said, breaking the silence. "You never take time for yourself." I smiled, slightly caught off guard. "That's what moms do, Liam. There's always something to take care of." He shook his head, his gaze fixed on me. "You do too much. You deserve a break." His words made my chest tighten. "That's sweet of you to say," I replied. "But I'm really fine." That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying that moment in my mind. Was it just an innocent gesture, or was I imagining something more? What was happening between us? I would soon find out. In the days that followed, I noticed Liam increasingly finding reasons to be near me. If I was cooking, he'd come into the kitchen to talk. If I was in the garden, he'd wander outside to sit with me. His compliments kept coming, each one making me feel more unsettled. To be honest, I found myself doing the same more often than I should have. "You bring this house to life," he said one afternoon while I was folding laundry. I froze for a moment, unsure of how to respond. "Thank you, Liam," I said finally, forcing a smile. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing, and not in a way I was comfortable with. The unease I felt grew stronger. I kept telling myself I was imagining things, that Liam was just being kind. Maybe he was trying to make up for the distance between us after Mark's death. But it wasn't just the compliments, it was how he acted around me. One afternoon, I was chopping vegetables for dinner in the kitchen when I heard Liam walk in behind me, his footsteps light on the tiled floor. I didn't turn around, focusing on the task at hand, hoping he'd grab a snack and leave. "Do you need help, Mom?" he asked. I glanced over my shoulder and gave him a quick smile. "Sure, you can chop these carrots," I said, sliding the cutting board toward him. He stepped up beside me, his movements deliberate, and began cutting. For a while, we worked in silence. He sat down next to me, leaving only a small distance between us. For a while, neither of us spoke. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. "You seem tired," Liam finally said, breaking the silence. I looked at him, startled. "Maybe a little," I admitted, forcing a small smile. "You do so much for everyone," he continued, his voice soft. "I don't think anyone ever stops to ask how you're really doing." His words struck a chord deep within me. "I'm fine, Liam," I said, keeping my tone light. "Taking care of you is my priority, and I don't mind it." "But who takes care of you?" he asked, his gaze intense again. The question caught me off guard. I looked away, pretending to focus on the flowers in the garden. "Moms don't really think about things like that," I replied, laughing softly. "You should," he said firmly. I turned back to him, noticing how serious he looked. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. "Liam," I began, choosing my words carefully, "I appreciate that you're worried about me. But I'm okay, really." He nodded, though I could tell he wasn't entirely convinced. "I just want you to know that you're not alone," he said. "I know," I replied, smiling at him. "Thank you, Liam." We sat in silence again, but the air between us felt heavier than before. I could sense that he wanted to say more, but he held back. Eventually, he stood up and gave me a small smile. "I'll be inside if you need me," he said before walking back into the house. I sat there for a while longer, my mind racing. There was something about our conversation that didn't sit right with me. His concern was touching, but it felt different. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting between us, and I wasn't sure how to handle it. For a moment, we were silent. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. "You've been quiet lately," he finally said. "I just have a lot on my mind," I replied, still staring at the garden. "Is it about me?" he asked softly, but with a seriousness that caught me off guard. The question surprised me, and I hesitated before answering. "Why do you think that?" He shrugged. "I don't know. I just feel like maybe I've done something to upset you." "You haven't," I said quickly. "I've just been tired." He nodded but didn't say anything else. After a few more minutes, he stood up. "I'll leave you alone," he said quietly. I watched him walk into the house, and a pang of guilt formed in my chest. He hadn't done anything wrong, so why did I feel so uneasy? The days after felt strange, as though a heavy cloud had settled over the house. I tried to act normal, cooking, cleaning, and going about my usual routine, but I couldn't shake the tension I felt whenever Liam was near. He hadn't done anything overtly wrong, but his presence lingered in a different way. Then one night, trying to keep my distance, I retreated to my bedroom earlier than usual after dinner, hoping for some quiet time alone. I curled up with a book, letting the soft light of the lamp create a small, warm cocoon. It felt like a rare reprieve from the unsettling dynamic that had begun to develop. I felt both tense and oddly exhilarated when I thought about Liam, and it was the first time I realized it. The thought startled me because I couldn't accept the truth that Liam was my biological son. Just as I began to relax, there was a gentle knock at the door. "Mom?" Liam's voice was soft, almost hesitant. I hesitated before responding. "Yes? Can I come in?" I glanced at the clock. It was late, long past the time Liam usually went to bed. "Is something wrong?" I asked as I sat up. "I just wanted to talk," he said. I sighed, setting my book aside. "All right." The door creaked open, and Liam stepped in. He looked different, not the confident young man he usually was, but more like the boy I used to comfort after nightmares when he was little. He stood at the doorway for a moment, as though unsure whether to come closer. "What's on your mind?" I asked, patting the edge of the bed. He sat down, his movements slow and careful. For a moment, he said nothing, his eyes fixed on the floor. Then he looked up, meeting my gaze. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry," he finally said. "For what?" I asked, my voice cautious. "For making you uncomfortable," he said sincerely. "I know I've been acting differently lately, and I don't want to make things weird between us." I blinked, surprised by his honesty. "Liam," I began, but he interrupted me. I've been feeling a lot of things, and I don't really know how to deal with them," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "But I don't want to hurt you." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning I couldn't fully grasp, or perhaps I didn't want to. I reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Liam, feeling confused is normal," I said gently. "But you need to remember that I'm your mother, and our relationship has boundaries." He nodded, his eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I know." "I'm sorry," he said again, his voice barely a whisper. I squeezed his shoulder reassuringly before withdrawing my hand. "Don't worry about it anymore," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "We'll figure this out together." There was a certain tension and excitement between us that I couldn't quite name. His gaze told me there was more to say, and I met his eyes. He nodded again, standing up. "Good night, Mom," he said softly before leaving the room. I watched him go, a strange mix of relief and sadness washing over me. He had acknowledged the tension between us, which felt like a step in the right direction. But I couldn't help wondering if things would truly go back to normal. One thing was clear to me, this wasn't the last time he would do something like this. And I was right, absolutely right, because the next time he did, everything would end very differently. The next morning, I woke up feeling more exhausted than usual. The conversation with Liam had kept me awake for hours, my mind racing with unanswered questions and what-ifs. I got up, went through my morning routine, and tried to shake off the lingering unease. Liam seemed different that day, quieter, more withdrawn. He kept to himself, spending most of the day in his room. Part of me wanted to check on him, to make sure he was okay. But another part of me felt that I needed to give him space. That evening, as I was folding laundry in the living room, Liam came in. He sat down on the couch without a word, silently watching me as I worked. The silence between us felt heavy, and I struggled to think of something to say. "You've been quiet today," I said finally, glancing at him. He shrugged. "Just thinking." "About something specific?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "About us," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I froze for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. "What do you mean?" I asked carefully. He hesitated, his eyes darting between me and the floor. "I mean, I know things have been weird lately, and I don't want it to be like this anymore," he said. I nodded slowly, unsure how to respond. "I don't want it to be like this either," I said finally. But we need to figure out a way to move forward. He nodded, offering a weak smile as he bit his lip. We will, he said. For a moment, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe things would get better. Maybe we could work through this and find a way to rebuild our relationship. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing on the edge of something I didn't fully understand, or perhaps I did, but I didn't want to accept it. The quiet unease that had settled over the house hadn't disappeared. Liam tried to act normal, but I could see the struggle in his eyes, the way he hesitated before speaking or lingered too long when we crossed paths. I wanted to believe that his apology had marked the end of everything, but deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. And then, one evening, as I lay in bed scrolling through my phone in an attempt to relax, it happened again. It was late, and the house was quiet, save for the gentle whirring of the ceiling fan above. I had just started to drift off when I heard a soft knock at my bedroom door. For the rest of that evening, I was trapped in my thoughts. My mind replayed the conversation with Liam over and over, dissecting every word, every hesitation, every lingering glance. I couldn't shake the unease that had settled into my chest like a weight, pressing down with every breath I took. The next few days passed in a blur of routine. I tried to keep busy, cooking, cleaning, running errands, but no matter what I did, the tension between Liam and me lingered like an invisible wall. He became quieter, spending most of his time in his room, and when we did cross paths, the air felt charged, heavy with unspoken words. I told myself to give him space, that he needed time to sort out his feelings and regain his balance. But deep down, I was scared. Scared of what might happen if we didn't address this tension head-on. Scared of what I might hear if we did. Then, one evening, everything came to a head. I was folding laundry in the living room when Liam came in. He sat on the couch silently, watching me. I could feel his gaze on me, but I didn't know what to say. You've been quiet today, I finally said, glancing at him. He shrugged. Just thinking. About something in particular? I asked, trying to sound casual. About us, he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. I froze for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. What do you mean? I asked carefully. He hesitated, his eyes flicking between me and the floor. I mean, I know things have been weird lately, and I don't want it to be like this anymore. I nodded slowly, unsure of how to respond. I don't want that either, I said finally. But we need to figure out how to move forward. He nodded, offering a weak smile. We will, he said. For a brief moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe things could get better. Maybe we could work through this and find a way to rebuild our relationship. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing on the edge of something I didn't fully understand. Or maybe I did understand, but I didn't want to admit it. The quiet unease that had settled over the house still hadn't lifted. Liam was trying to act normal, but I could see the struggle in his eyes, the way he hesitated before speaking or lingered too long when we crossed paths. I wanted to believe that his apology had marked the end of it all, but deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. And then, one night, as I lay in bed scrolling through my phone in an attempt to relax, it happened again. It was late, and the house was silent except for the soft hum of the ceiling fan overhead. I had just started to drift off to sleep when I heard the light knock at my bedroom door. Mom? Liam's voice was soft, almost hesitant. I sat up, my heart sinking. Yes? Can I come in? He asked. I glanced at the clock. It was well past midnight. Liam, it's late, I said, trying to keep my tone calm. What's wrong? There was a pause before he replied. I just need to talk to you. Something in his voice gave me pause. I took a deep breath before saying, all right, come in. The door creaked open, and Liam stepped inside. He looked uncertain, his hands shoved into his pockets as he lingered near the doorway. What's wrong, Liam? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He hesitated, his gaze flicking between me and the floor. I've been thinking a lot about what I said the other night, he began, his voice low. And I feel like I need to be honest with you. My chest tightened. Honest about what? I asked carefully. He stepped closer, sitting down on the edge of the bed. About how I feel, he said, his voice trembling slightly. I know it's wrong, and I've been trying to ignore it, but I can't stop thinking about you. My breath caught in my throat. I stared at him, my mind racing. Liam, you can't, I began, but he cut me off. I know, he said quickly, his voice desperate. I know it's wrong, but I can't help it. You've been everything to me since Dad died. You're kind and strong, and you've done so much for me. I don't know how to stop feeling this way. His words hit me like a blow. I felt frozen, unable to move or speak as his confession hung heavy in the air. Liam, you're my son, I finally said, my voice trembling. I love you, but not like that. This has to stop. I know, he whispered, tears welling in his eyes. I'm sorry. I just needed to tell you. I reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. Liam, what you're feeling is a result of everything we've been through. It's not real. You're young, and you're confused, but this isn't right. We need to work through this together. He nodded, his shoulders slumping. I'm sorry, he said softly. I didn't mean to hurt you. I know, I said, trying to keep my voice gentle. But we can't let this continue. You're a good person, Liam, and you'll get through this. He wiped at his eyes and stood up slowly. Good night, Mom, he said, his voice barely audible. Good night, I replied, watching as he left the room and closed the door behind him. As soon as he was gone, I locked the door and sat back down on the bed, my hands trembling. I couldn't believe what had just happened. I felt overwhelmed with guilt and confusion, questioning everything I had done that might have led to this moment. I loved Liam with all my heart, but his feelings were something I couldn't ignore or dismiss. That night, I barely slept, replaying his words over and over in my mind, trying to make sense of them. I told myself it was just a phase, a moment of confusion that would pass. But deep down, I wasn't sure. I feel stuck and don't know how to handle this situation without making things worse. That night, I sat in the living room, staring at the TV without actually watching it, while the house was quiet, and I could feel the weight of everything pressing down on me. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. Turning around, I saw Liam standing at the doorway, his expression unreadable. Can I sit with you? He asked. I hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Of course. He walked over and sat on the couch, leaving a small gap between us. For a moment, we sat in silence, the tension filling the air. Finally, he spoke softly, I don't want to lose you. I quickly replied, I won't do that. But we need to set boundaries, Liam. This is necessary for both of us. He nodded, his gaze falling to the floor. I understand, he said. I reached out and placed a hand on his knee. We'll get through this, I said gently. But I need you to trust me. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with emotion. I agree, he said. I smiled faintly, hoping to reassure him. We'll be okay. As we sat there, I felt a flicker of hope that we could overcome this, but deep down, I knew it would take time. In the days that followed, things between us remained tense. Liam stayed silent, keeping his distance, and I tried to act as if everything was normal. However, the truth weighed heavily on me. I hoped that acknowledging the situation and setting boundaries would help us move forward, but something deep inside told me that the silence between us wasn't enough to heal what had been broken. One night, I went to bed early, exhausted after a day of trying to keep my thoughts in check. The house was quiet, the cool night air drifting through the window. I tried to let the sound of the fan help me sleep, but my mind wouldn't settle. At some point, I drifted off, only to be woken suddenly by the creak of the door opening. My heart pounded as I tried to orient myself in the dark. Mom? Liam's voice softly called. I sat up, quickly turning on the bedside lamp. The warm light revealed Liam, standing in the doorway, looking uncertain. I can't sleep, he whispered. I need to see you. I felt a lump in my throat as I tried to steady my breathing. Liam, now is not the time, I said firmly. You need to go back to bed. He stared at me, his eyes filled with conflict. You're the only one who really cares about me, he murmured. You've always been there for me in a way no one else has. I felt a tightness in my throat. Liam, I care about you because I'm your mother, I said. That's my responsibility, but that feeling isn't healthy, and it's not right. He stood still, his shoulders slumped as if my words were weighing on him. I'm sorry, he said, tears in his eyes. I don't know how else to say it. I looked at him, feeling heartbroken, but trying to stay calm. Feeling confused is normal, Liam. But this needs to be dealt with the right way. I will help you as your mother, and only as your mother. He nodded slowly, his gaze heavy. I don't want to lose you, he whispered, barely audible. I won't leave, I promise, I assured him. But we need to move forward, Liam, for both of us. As I said those words, something inside me shifted. I wondered what I was doing and why I couldn't help my son the way he wanted. I felt heartbroken when my words disappointed him, and I didn't want that anymore. Part of me even liked what he wanted, perhaps because I missed Mark so much. After a brief moment of silence, I called him closer. Liam, come here. I invited him to sit next to me, and he moved toward me, his eyes open again. We looked at each other, and then, the inevitable happened. We kissed, and it was a passionate kiss. After a moment, he pulled back, not out of doubt, but because he had started touching me, just like Mark used to. So that night changed everything. A crazy night, but also emotional, one I would never forget. When he left, I still felt heartbroken, but a little hope grew inside me. The next morning, Liam and I had breakfast together. Although things were still pretty quiet, I could feel a change in his attitude. He seemed to have shed some of the weight he had been carrying for the past weeks. We didn't speak about what had happened, but the understanding between us was clear. We were trying to move forward. One evening, as we sat on the porch, watching the sunset, Liam turned to me and said, Mom, thank you for being patient and helping me. His words touched me, and I smiled. That's what mothers do, I replied. For the first time in many weeks, I felt a sense of relief and certainty that we would be okay.